Summer, 1986. The first sign wasn't the reservoir. It wasn't the wells. And it wasn't the water restrictions that would eventually appear across Silver Creek. The first sign arrived inside the town bakery. One Tuesday morning, the owner noticed the water pressure had dropped again. Not completely. Just enough. The sinks filled slower. The dishwashers ran longer. The coffee machines struggled during the breakfast rush. At first nobody worried. Mountain towns dealt with minor water issues every summer. But by August, similar complaints began appearing everywhere. The school, the feed store, the gas station, the small clinic near Main Street. Something was happening, and nobody understood why. Silver Creek sat high in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by abandoned mines, pine forests, and steep granite ridges. For nearly 80 years the town had depended on the same water system. Mountain runoff, reservoir storage, gravity-fed supply lines. Simple, reliable, quiet. The kind of system people stopped thinking about because it always worked. Until it didn't. By mid-August, reservoir levels had dropped lower than expected. Far lower. Town officials blamed drought. That explanation seemed reasonable. The region had received less snowfall for 2 consecutive winters. Streams were running weak. Pastures looked dry. Everything pointed toward drought. Everything except the numbers. Because according to the engineering reports, the reservoir should not have been dropping this fast. The math didn't fit. Water was disappearing somewhere. And nobody knew where. The town council held emergency meetings. Water restrictions were discussed. Businesses began preparing for shortages. Residents filled extra storage tanks just in case. Then someone mentioned Harold Mercer. Most younger residents barely knew the name. The older ones remembered. Retired mining engineer. Survey specialist. Spent 40 years studying tunnels beneath the mountains surrounding Silver Creek. 76 years old. Quiet. Observant. The kind of man who noticed details long after everyone else stopped looking. Harold lived alone on a small property overlooking the valley. Most mornings followed the same routine. Coffee. Weather notes. A slow walk around the property. Then several hours reading old engineering journals inside a workshop filled with survey maps and notebooks. He wasn't looking for work anymore. Retirement suited him. But one evening while reading the local newspaper, a single sentence caught his attention. The article described the reservoir decline. The numbers seemed ordinary at first. Then Harold read them again. And immediately frowned. Because he had seen those numbers before. Not recently. Nearly 40 years earlier. Back in 1948. The year engineers modified part of Silver Creek's underground drainage system. Harold stood slowly from his chair. Walked toward a metal filing cabinet. And pulled out a faded survey notebook. Dust drifted from the cover as he opened it. Page after page of measurements. Flow calculations. Tunnel inspections. Old notes from another era. Then he found what he was looking for. A hand-drawn map dated October 1948. Harold stared at it for a long time. Because one line on that map should not have existed anymore. Yet according to the reservoir data, it might still be affecting the town. Outside, evening shadows moved across the valley. Inside the workshop, Harold traced a finger along the faded pencil markings. Then quietly said something nobody else in Silver Creek was saying. Water doesn't just disappear. He looked back at the map. And suddenly wondered if the town had spent nearly 40 years forgetting where some of it was supposed to go. The next morning, Harold Mercer drove into town before sunrise. Silver Creek looked normal at first. That was the dangerous thing about infrastructure problems. Most people couldn't see them. The streets remained open. The lights still worked. Water still came from the taps. Just a little less than before. And every day, a little less again. Harold parked his old Ford pickup beside the town reservoir overlook and climbed out carrying the survey notebook. The air felt dry. Even for August. A thin ring of exposed shoreline wrapped around the reservoir below. Harold studied it through binoculars. Then frowned. The water level had dropped nearly 18 inches since the newspaper photograph taken only 3 weeks earlier. That wasn't right. Not even during drought. A reservoir could lose water from evaporation, consumption, leakage, diversion. But the numbers in the newspaper suggested something else. The loss rate was accelerating, as if more water was leaving the system every week. That bothered him, because natural droughts rarely behaved that neatly. By late morning, he arrived at the Silver Creek Water Office. Sarah Collins was already dealing with angry residents. A rancher wanted additional water permits. A restaurant owner complained about pressure drops. A motel manager worried about upcoming tourist bookings. Everybody wanted answers. Nobody had any. When Harold finally stepped into her office, Sarah looked exhausted. "Harold." He nodded. "Sarah, you hear about the reservoir too?" "Yes." She sighed heavily. "Then get in line." Harold sat down quietly. Not offended. Just patient. Eventually Sarah handed him the latest engineering reports. "We think it's drought." Harold read silently for several minutes. Reservoir levels. Flow measurements. Consumption estimates. Then he stopped, looked up, and asked a question. "Who measured the inflow?" Sarah blinked. "What? The inflow?" She pointed toward the report. "Engineering department." Harold shook his head slowly. "No. I mean where?" That was different. And suddenly Sarah understood. Most reports measured how much water entered the reservoir. Harold wanted to know where those measurements were taken. Two very different questions. An hour later they found the answer. The monitoring station sat nearly 4 miles upstream, above several old mining drainage systems, above several abandoned tunnels, above one particular area Harold remembered very well. The younger civil engineer, Daniel Reed, joined the meeting shortly afterward. He reviewed Harold's concerns politely, then disagreed almost immediately. The reservoir's losing water because of drought. Harold nodded. "Partly." Daniel folded his arms. "You think something else is happening?" Harold slid the 1948 map across the table. The younger engineer studied it. Most of the markings were faded. Several notes barely readable. Then Daniel pointed toward a pencil line running through the mountain ridge west of town. "What's this?" Harold leaned forward. "That's what I'm trying to remember." The room became quiet, because even Harold wasn't completely certain yet. Only suspicious. And engineering investigations built on suspicion alone rarely went far. By afternoon, the town council announced preliminary water restrictions. Nothing severe. But enough to make people nervous. Outside the grocery store, residents discussed drought forecasts. Inside the feed store, ranchers compared reservoir rumors. Across town, concern spread faster than facts. Meanwhile, Harold drove toward the western ridge carrying the old map. The road climbed through pine forest before ending near a forgotten mining access trail. Most people hadn't used it in years. The trail led toward abandoned survey points dating back to the 1940s. Harold walked slowly, notebook in hand, mountain wind moving through the trees. Eventually, he reached an old concrete marker nearly hidden beneath grass and brush. Survey Station 12. Exactly where the map said it would be. He brushed dirt from the top, then looked toward the valley below. And for the first time since the crisis began, he saw something that made his stomach tighten. Far below the reservoir, far below the monitoring stations, a narrow stream of water moved through a drainage channel that should have been dry. Harold stared at it. The channel wasn't supposed to carry water anymore. Not since the modifications of 1948. Yet there it was, flowing steadily through the mountainside, disappearing toward abandoned mining land nobody monitored anymore. The old engineer looked down at the faded map, then back toward the channel, and quietly realized the town's missing water might not be missing at all. It might simply be going somewhere nobody had checked in nearly 40 years. The next morning, Harold Mercer returned to the water office carrying photographs. Not theories, not memories. Photographs. That mattered. Because engineering departments trusted evidence more than stories. Sarah Collins spread the images across the conference table while Daniel Reed studied them carefully. The photographs clearly showed water flowing through the abandoned drainage channel west of town. The same channel that official records claimed had been inactive for decades. Daniel frowned. How much flow? Harold shrugged slightly. More than there should be. That answer wasn't enough for Daniel. Engineers liked numbers, measurements, calculations, things that could be written inside reports. So before noon, the three of them drove back to the western ridge carrying survey equipment and portable flow meters. Clouds gathered over the mountains while they worked. Not rain clouds, just thin high-altitude haze drifting across the peaks. The drought remained firmly in control. By early afternoon, Daniel completed the measurements. Then checked them again. Then a third time. Each reading produced nearly the same result. Finally, he lowered the clipboard slowly. This can't be right. Sarah looked up. What? Daniel pointed toward the channel. That's almost 15% of the reservoir inflow. Silence. 15%. Not enough to notice during wet years. More than enough to become a crisis during drought. Harold nodded quietly. The numbers finally matched. The disappearing reservoir. The strange inflow reports. The accelerating water loss. Everything fit. The water wasn't vanishing. It was leaving. The question now was why. 3 days later they entered the county archive basement. Again. This time searching specifically for mining records. Old survey maps. Construction reports. Tunnel modifications. Anything connected to the Western Ridge drainage system. Dust covered nearly every box. Many documents hadn't been touched for decades. Daniel spent most of the morning reading engineering summaries while Harold searched through handwritten field reports from the 1940s. Then shortly after lunch he found it. A folded document marked Western Diversion Modification, October 1948. Harold unfolded the pages carefully. The paper crackled beneath his fingers. Inside sat a detailed explanation of a temporary engineering project completed after heavy flooding damaged part of the mining district. A diversion tunnel had been constructed. Temporary. Emergency use only. Water would be rerouted through an abandoned mining corridor until permanent repairs could be completed. Expected duration. 6 months. Harold stared at the page. Then read it again. 6 months. Not 40 years. Daniel immediately understood the problem. If they never removed the diversion. Harold nodded. Then part of the reservoir system has been draining into the wrong watershed since 1948. The room fell quiet. Because the implications were enormous. Not criminal. Not dramatic. Just forgotten. The kind of mistake that grows slowly enough to survive generations. The next week an inspection crew followed the old maps deep into the abandoned mining district west of Silver Creek. The terrain became rough quickly. Collapsed roads. Broken rail beds. Overgrown survey markers. Most of the infrastructure had disappeared beneath decades of mountain weather. Eventually they found the tunnel. Or what remained of it. A rusted steel portal sat hidden beneath pine trees and rockfall. Water flowed steadily from the darkness beyond. Far more than anyone expected. Daniel shined his flashlight inside. The tunnel stretched deep beneath the mountain. Still functioning. Still moving water. Still following engineering instructions that should have ended during the Truman administration. The discovery should have solved everything. Instead, it created a new problem. About 600 feet inside the tunnel, part of the structure had collapsed. Massive rockfall blocked the original control section. Access to the diversion gate was impossible. Repair estimates arrived 3 days later. They were expensive. Very expensive. The town council reacted immediately. Several members wanted to stop the project. Others argued the drought would eventually end on its own. Funding became uncertain. Support weakened. And for the first time since beginning the investigation, Harold felt the project slipping away. One evening he sat alone beside the reservoir overlook watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The water looked lower again. Sarah arrived shortly before sunset. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally she asked, "You ever think we're too late?" Harold watched the exposed shoreline below, then slowly shook his head. "No. You sound pretty sure." The old engineer smiled faintly. "Water's patient." Sarah looked toward the mountains. "What about people?" Harold thought about the town, the businesses, the ranchers, the families depending on the reservoir. Then he answered honestly, "That's what worries me." Because deep inside the mountain sat the answer to Silver Creek's disappearing water. But finding the truth had been easier than convincing people it was worth fixing. For nearly 2 weeks, Silver Creek remained stuck between two problems. The drought was getting worse, and the solution was getting more expensive. Town meetings grew tense. Reservoir levels continued falling. Every new report seemed to add pressure. The strange thing was that nobody questioned Harold's discovery anymore. The evidence was clear. The forgotten diversion tunnel existed. Water was leaving the system. The real argument had become whether the town could afford to fix it. Harold rarely attended the public meetings. He preferred spending his mornings studying the original tunnel drawings spread across the workbench inside his workshop. Coffee, maps, notes. The same routine. One rainy afternoon, one of the few rain showers that summer, Daniel Reed arrived carrying a box of copied records from the county archives. "We found something." Harold looked up. Daniel placed several documents on the table. Construction photographs, inspection reports, maintenance records. Then one photograph stopped both men cold. The image showed workers standing beside the diversion control chamber in 1948. Behind them sat a steel gate assembly, and above the gate was a handwritten maintenance note. "Emergency bypass gate remains manually accessible from upper shaft." Harold stared at the photograph, then slowly stood. Because according to modern repair estimates, crews needed to clear 600 feet of collapsed tunnel before reaching the diversion controls. But if the photograph was accurate, there might be another way. A forgotten access shaft. Neither engineer spoke for several seconds. Then Harold quietly said, "Let's go find it." The access shaft took 3 days to locate. Decades of brush growth had nearly erased every trace of it. Old survey markers helped. So did Harold's memory. Eventually they found a rusted steel hatch hidden beneath pine trees and loose stone high on the western ridge. Most people would have walked past it. The opening looked insignificant. Just another forgotten piece of mining infrastructure. But below the hatch, the original access ladder still existed. The descent took nearly 40 minutes. Flashlights illuminated damp rock walls as workers carefully moved deeper into the mountain. The shaft connected directly to the upper control chamber, exactly where the old photograph suggested. And for the first time since the crisis began, everyone felt hope. Then they found the gate, and hope disappeared again. The mechanism hadn't moved in decades. Rust covered the gearing. Mineral deposits sealed parts of the control system. Nothing turned. Nothing shifted. The emergency bypass remained completely open, allowing precious water to escape continuously into the wrong drainage basin. Daniel examined the controls, then looked toward Harold. "It's frozen solid." The old engineer nodded. The mountain had protected its secret well, but it wasn't going to surrender easily. The repair operation lasted 4 days. Workers cleaned gears, removed corrosion, replaced damaged linkage components. Every small victory revealed another problem. Several times the crew considered giving up. Several times progress stopped entirely. Meanwhile, Silver Creek's reservoir continued shrinking. The town was running out of time. Then on the 5th morning, something finally changed. A gear moved. Only a few inches. But it moved. The entire chamber went silent. Workers watched carefully. Daniel turned the control wheel again. Slowly. The gate responded. Not much, but enough. Harold smiled for the first time in weeks. Because machinery always gave the same signal when it wanted to live again. Movement. Even tiny movement. The rest could be earned. That afternoon the gate finally closed. Not completely. Partially. Exactly as the original operating plans required. Everyone waited. The mountain remained silent. Then, several minutes later, the sound arrived. Water. Deep inside the tunnel system. Changing direction. Returning. Flow monitors downstream responded first. Then the reservoir instruments. Then the water office. By evening, measurable increases appeared throughout the system. Small, but real. The forgotten water was coming home. Over the following weeks, reservoir decline slowed. Then stopped. Then gradually reversed. The drought didn't end overnight. But Silver Creek finally had a chance. Restrictions eased. Businesses remained open. Ranchers kept their herds. And for the first time all summer, people stopped talking about shortages. They started talking about the old engineer instead. Harold never liked that part. Recognition felt uncomfortable. The work mattered more. Months later, after autumn storms returned to the mountains, he visited the western ridge one final time. The reservoir below looked healthier now. Clouds reflected across the water. Pine forests swayed gently in the cold wind. Harold carried the same survey notebook that had started everything. He opened it near the final pages. Then added one last note. Not a calculation. Not a measurement. Just a sentence. The most dangerous mistakes are the ones that become normal. He closed the notebook, looked across the valley, and quietly watched the water moving exactly where it was supposed to go. If stories like this still deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing.